The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined. So the way of the sea was an international road that came down through Syria, through the Golan Heights, down past Capernaum, down through this area, past Megiddo, which is later called Armageddon, and onto the sea. And any invading army would come down through here. And this is the shadow of death. Like if an army was trying to make its way to Jerusalem, they had to conquer all these areas first, which are part of the tribal lands of Naphtali and Zebulun. So they're being vexed. There's this dimness, there's this darkness, because the Assyrian king is coming in and causing havoc. And so the people are waiting for relief to be overcome the king of Assyria and his hordes. And then what happens hundreds of years later? Jesus grows up in this area. He's the light of the world. He emerges from this area that had seen so much death and destruction over the years. Remember, Megiddo is right here. It's a city that was destroyed dozens of times, so much so that it became proverbial, called Armageddon, because that's where destruction happened. It's literally across the valley from where Nazareth is, where Jesus grew up, and not far from Capernaum. So these verses have very important significance for the time of Isaiah, Jesus' day, and even symbolically, we understand that Armageddon represents, in the last days, God will once again bring forth his light to overthrow the forces of darkness that are impinging upon his people.
Beautiful concept that in Jesus' day, him growing up in the land of Zebulun, the tribal region of Zebulun, and then relocating over to the tribal region for Naphtali, being included here, you'll notice in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 4, verse 14 through 16, this is coming from Matthew, who seems to be largely writing to Jewish men and trying to convince them that Jesus is the Christ. And he references this Isaiah passage and says, see, Jesus moved from Nazareth down to Capernaum at the beginning of his ministry, and that's a fulfillment of this Isaiah prophecy. Upon them hath the light shined, this God with us from before. Well, he's the one who shines down on the people who are in the valley of the shadow of death. Now, you don't have to live in Israel to have this story likened to you the way Matthew likened it to Christ ultimately in his day. Because some of you are currently going through a valley of the shadow of death. And isn't it amazing if you'll look up to seek the light, to see the light shining on you, and that light being Jesus Christ. His promise is sure that he's there. Look at what happens a few verses later, verse 6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Are you seeing the repetition here? And the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. There's one person that ultimately fulfills this Isaiah prophecy, and it wasn't somebody living in 740 to 701, and it's not anybody living today or in the millennium on the earth. It's somebody who was born 700 years after Isaiah, and it's upon him that the government would be placed on his shoulder. And by the way, notice the first few lines, for unto us a child is born. That child wasn't just born to Mary. That child wasn't just adopted by Joseph. He was born to us. He was the greatest gift ever given to the earth in the history of eternity. And it's God's gift of love, of giving his own son to then take the throne of David, verse 7. So at the end of chapter 9 and leading into chapter 10, you get this phrase that gets repeated a handful of times, where he says that the hand of the Lord is stretched out still. And then there's more destruction than it says his hand is stretched out still. There are a lot of debates as to whether that means that the Lord is, in the midst of all of these strugglings, the Lord is still loving, kindly there helping. And others would say on the opposite side of that debate, no, his hand represents this punishment that we were talking about in chapter 1 through 39 is he's punished them, and the punishment isn't just to inflict pain. The punishment is intended to cause pain that would make them change their behavior, change their attitudes and their direction of life. But they don't change. So his hand is stretched out still. He punishes them again. And they still don't change. His hand is stretched out still. I don't know which camp or somewhere in the middle that you want to fall. The point is that in our own life, when God corrects us, I hope we can feel the hope and the loving, tender arms of mercy enfolding us even in the midst of correction, but also let any pain that comes cause us to turn heavenward and outward rather than inward and into a state of pity or self-loathing even in some cases, but that we turn towards our solution.